This is my true story. I never thought the child I carried in my arms would one day carry me to a nursing home and leave me there. My daughter said it was for my own good, but it felt like being discarded. I had built her future, paid for her comfort, and loved her without limits, and she repaid it with distance. I sat in that room, surrounded by strangers, wondering when I had become a burden. But I didn't cry for long. I made a plan. Before that, tell me where you're watching from. And subscribe for more true stories like mine. He had built his life around the idea that love, when given honestly, always returns. Every decision he made, every sacrifice, every sleepless night, was shaped by that belief. From the moment his daughter was born, she became his world. He was not a man of great riches, but he was rich in effort. His hands were old before his hair turned gray, calloused from years of building things with care, a home, a future, and a child who was supposed to never feel lack. He worked in silence, never complaining, even when his back ached and his eyes burned from long hours. His wife passed early, leaving him alone with a little girl who looked like both pain and purpose at once. Every morning, he would braid her hair, pack her lunch, and watch her wave from the school gate. He told himself that no matter how hard life became, he would give her everything he could, so that one day she'd never have to struggle like he did. Money was tight, but he learned the art of stretching little into enough. Some nights he ate less so she could have more. When winter came, he pretended he wasn't cold so she could keep the extra blanket. There were times when he had nothing left but willpower, and even then, he smiled. He taught her to read by candlelight, sitting beside her as she struggled with long words, telling her stories that always ended with hope. He wanted her to grow not just into a smart woman, but a kind one. Years passed, and his sacrifices bore fruit. His daughter graduated with pride in her eyes that once looked at him as if he were the entire universe. He worked extra shifts to pay for her college, selling old tools and even a piece of land that once belonged to his parents. When she walked across that graduation stage, he clapped until his palms hurt. That day, he thought, I did my part. Now, she will never know hardship. He believed that love, once planted, grew deeper with time. But what he didn't know was that in some hearts, love has an expiration date. When she married, he gave her his blessings and half of his savings for her new life. He didn't think twice. After all, she was his blood, his pride, his only. The wedding photos captured smiles, but behind his, there was a quiet fear that one day she might forget the man who built her foundation. Still, he pushed it away. Doubt, he believed, was poison to love. After marriage, the calls began to slow. The visits grew shorter. The voice that once laughed in his small kitchen became busy, hurried, distracted. Later, Papa became her favorite phrase, but he didn't complain. He knew life gets busy. He waited, days, weeks, sometimes months, just to hear her say, "How are you, Papa?" But love, he learned, is not a debt that everyone repays. When his health began to weaken, he tried not to show it. He didn't want to be a burden. He moved slower, rested more, and relied on the kindness of neighbors for small errands. He still believed that one day she'd walk through the door and notice the fading strength in his hands. She'd say, "Come stay with us, Papa." He imagined that moment often. It kept him going. Instead, what came was a suggestion, polite at first, then firm. She said the house was too far, the city was too busy, and that he needed professional care. The words sounded kind, but the meaning underneath was cold. He tried to reason, saying he was fine where he was, that the home held memories of his wife and her laughter. But she had made up her mind. She told him it was for his safety. He didn't argue. He never did. That had always been his flaw, loving quietly, even when the world turned loud against him. The day he moved into the home, he looked around at the small, sterile room. It smelled of medicine and bleach. There were other elders there, faces tired, eyes lost somewhere between memory and waiting. The nurses smiled kindly, but it wasn't the same as being smiled at by family. He placed his small bag on the bed, sat down, and exhaled the kind of sigh that carries years of confusion. How can love disappear from where it was, once so abundant? He spent the first few nights in silence. The sound of rain outside reminded him of the nights when he used to tell her stories. Stories about loyalty, forgiveness, and family. Now, he was living one he never would have told. Each raindrop outside hit the window like a question he couldn't answer. He remembered all the small moments, her tiny hands clinging to his fingers when crossing the street, her tears when she scraped her knees, her laughter echoing through the house when he surprised her with gifts he couldn't afford. Every memory now felt like a ghost, alive but unreachable. But inside that ache, something else began to grow, something sharper, steadier, not anger, not revenge. Resolve. He realized that while she had placed him in a room to forget him, she had forgotten something crucial. He was still alive, and as long as he was alive, he wasn't done yet. He began to read again, not novels or poetry, but documents. Papers he had saved for decades. Property deeds, savings bonds, business certificates. The more he read, the clearer it became. He still had power. Power she didn't know existed because she never cared enough to look. He wasn't going to fight with words. He was going to fight with action. The same way he had built everything else, with patience, persistence, and precision. Every morning, he watched how the home was run, the staff, the management, the routines. He saw inefficiencies, weaknesses, and most of all, potential. Beneath the walls of care and sympathy, this place was still a business. And businesses, he knew, could be bought. The idea started small, like a whisper. But whispers, when fed with purpose, grow into plans. He visited the small office inside the home one afternoon, pretending to ask about care plans and expenses. The manager, polite and distracted, mentioned something about ownership and investors. That word, investors, stayed in his mind like a seed. He started to inquire quietly. He learned that the company managing the home had recently opened a small share offering to raise capital for expansion. To most, it was just a technicality. To him, it was an opening. He went through his accounts, liquidated small investments, sold unused land, and pooled what he had left. It wasn't easy. It took weeks of paperwork, calls, and meetings, but every signature he placed felt like reclaiming a part of himself that had been taken away the day she left him there. By the time it was done, the home was no longer just a place he lived in. It was a place he owned. He didn't announce it. He didn't gloat. He still sat in the same chair, still ate in the same dining hall, still smiled at the same nurses. But behind that quiet smile now lived strength, the kind that doesn't need to shout. And while she thought she had placed him away to fade into memory, he had just begun writing a new chapter. Time is strange. It changes the tone of love so slowly that you almost don't notice until it's gone. What once felt warm began to cool little by little. At first, it was small things, the forgotten phone calls, the quick replies, the sighs that came when he asked too many questions. His daughter had once called him every evening to tell him about her day. Now she sent short texts that felt like obligations, not affection. He told himself it was normal. People get busy. Life moves fast. But the silence between them grew longer than the conversations ever did. The visits that once filled his week with laughter began to disappear. At first, she came on weekends, bringing her husband and their little boy. Then the visits became every few weeks, then once a month. Eventually, even those stopped unless there was a reason, a form to sign, a document to discuss, or some matter of inheritance that required his approval. The hugs became polite. The smiles became rehearsed. The warmth in her voice turned into something he recognized too well, pity mixed with impatience. He could sense it, even before she said it aloud. That quiet disappointment children feel when they begin to see their parents as burdens, not blessings. It wasn't hate. It was something colder. Indifference. She had stopped needing him, and because of that, she had stopped caring. He often sat in his small chair by the window, watching the birds come and go. It reminded him of how she once used to come running into his arms after school, shouting his name, telling him about her day. Now, even when she visited, her eyes stayed on her phone more than on him. She scrolled through work messages while he sat quietly, nodding to words she barely spoke. He began to realize that love, when taken for granted, fades into routine, and routine, when left unattended, becomes neglect. There was a day he remembered vividly, the one that broke the illusion completely. She came to visit, her tone sharp, her steps quick. She didn't sit. She didn't ask how he was. She went straight to the point. "Papa," she said, "you can't live like this forever. You're old, you need supervision, and honestly, it's too much for us." She said us, but he knew it meant her. Her husband stood behind her, nodding like an echo. He smiled faintly, trying to hide the sting. "I'm fine," he said softly. But she didn't hear it. She didn't want to. Her mind had already made peace with a decision that would change everything. He saw it in her eyes. The same eyes that once glowed with innocence now carried calculation. Not cruelty, exactly, but something colder. She was thinking in terms of convenience, not compassion. And convenience never holds space for love. She left early that evening, leaving behind the faint scent of her perfume and the heavy silence of absence. He sat there long after she was gone, staring at the empty chair where she once sat and laughed as a child. It was strange, he thought, how quickly a home can turn into a museum of memories. Days turned into weeks. The calls stopped altogether. He tried once or twice to reach out, but the tone on the other end was short, distracted, and mechanical. He realized that he wasn't really talking to his daughter anymore. He was talking to someone who used to be her. He didn't blame her at first. That was his nature. He had spent his life forgiving, even before people apologized. He thought maybe it was his fault. Maybe he had leaned on her too much. Maybe he had made her feel guilty by existing. But as time passed, that guilt turned into clarity. Parents who give everything are often left with nothing, not because they did too little, but because they did too much. He noticed the shift in how she looked at him. It wasn't love anymore. It was duty. She'd come sometimes, drop off a few groceries, ask about his medicine, and then leave. The visits felt like transactions, ticking boxes of care without the warmth of it. He wanted to believe she still cared somewhere deep inside, but the truth was written in her eyes. She had outgrown him. Or rather, she thought she had. There's a kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone. It comes from being forgotten by someone who once knew your every heartbeat. That's what he felt now. He started noticing other things too. How her husband never looked him in the eye, how they spoke about him as if he weren't in the room. Words like retirement, nursing care, expenses floated through the air like sharp glass. He realized they had already decided what to do with him. He just hadn't been told yet. And then came the day that made it real. She brought brochures of care homes, smiling nurses, soft pastel colors, rooms that looked nothing like homes. She placed them on the table, flipping through pages as if showing him a new car catalog. "It's for your own good, Papa," she said. He didn't argue. He just looked at her, wondering when she had started talking to him like a patient instead of a parent. He wanted to remind her that it was his hands that built her childhood, that every wall she leaned on was painted by his labor, that every dream she chased was bought with his sleepless nights. But he stayed silent. Because silence, he'd learned, often says more than words ever can. After that visit, something inside him shifted. He stopped expecting love from her. He stopped waiting for calls. He stopped checking the window whenever he heard a car outside. He stopped hoping. Hope, after all, is just another kind of waiting. And waiting hurts more when you already know the answer. The neighbors noticed the change too. The cheerful old man who used to sweep his porch and greet everyone with a smile now kept to himself. He stopped tending to the garden. The flowers wilted, much like the laughter in his home. But even in his quiet grief, there was no anger, only a slow realization that the daughter he raised with softness had learned the world's hardness too well. Sometimes at night, he'd sit by his late wife's photo, He'd whisper to it, not words, but feelings. Did we do too much? Did we love too blindly? The photo, of course, never answered, but he could almost hear her voice saying what she used to when life got hard. Don't worry, just wait. He did wait, and in that waiting, a strange calm began to grow. He started writing again. Short notes to himself, reminders that he wasn't finished yet. He reread old letters, bank statements, property deeds. He began organizing his papers, something his daughter never cared to understand. Every line, every signature reminded him of what he still controlled, what was still his. And though she thought she had put him in a place where he would fade away, she didn't realize she had placed him exactly where he needed to be, surrounded by enough peace and time to plan. In the months that followed, his silence grew stronger than her words ever were. He spoke less, smiled less, but thought more. Every interaction became a study of her tone, her motives, her mistakes. She thought she had outsmarted an old man, but she had forgotten one thing. Age doesn't erase intelligence. It sharpens it in different ways. What she saw as weakness was simply wisdom in disguise. He knew the day would come when she would no longer ask, but decide. And when that day arrived, when she would finally push him toward the home, he promised himself that he would go quietly, not as a victim, but as an observer. Because those who go quietly often return louder than anyone expects. He looked around his house one last time, the photographs, the trophies, the clock that never stopped ticking even when everything else did. It wasn't a goodbye. It was an audit, an assessment of everything that was still rightfully his. Because while she had the will to remove him, he still had the means to remind her who made her. That thought, that quiet, unspoken truth, was the ember that would one day become the fire. The day it all finally shattered didn't come with shouting or warning. It came disguised as an ordinary afternoon. The air outside was heavy with clouds, gray and slow-moving, the kind of sky that always made him feel nostalgic. He had been waiting by the window, the way he always did, wondering if his daughter might stop by. He had grown used to disappointment by now, but hope is a stubborn thing. It survives, even when logic tells it not to. When the door finally opened, he looked up, expecting a smile. But her face wasn't warm. Her voice wasn't soft. She walked in briskly, her heels sharp against the floor, her husband behind her, eyes set on something far away. She didn't hug him. She didn't ask how he was. She didn't even look around at the home she had once called her own. She carried a folder under her arm. That was the first warning. She began speaking like someone reading from a script, words clean, practiced, emotionless. She said things about safety, care, and quality of life. She talked about professional supervision and assisted living. The phrases sounded clinical, like they had been rehearsed in front of a mirror to sound compassionate while staying firm. He sat in silence, listening, his old hands folded neatly on his lap. He didn't interrupt, didn't ask questions. He knew when someone had made up their mind. But then she said something that pierced through everything. "This is what's best for you, Papa." It wasn't best for him. It was convenient for her. Her husband stood quietly beside her, his body language telling the rest of the story. He wasn't here to comfort or mediate. He was here to make sure the decision stuck. She handed him a document, a neatly printed form with a company name he didn't recognize at first. The top read, Golden Horizon Senior Care Residence. Below it, there was a list of details, fees, policies, a space for signatures. He stared at it, the words blurring slightly. For a moment, he thought of all the papers he'd signed in his life, property deeds, school applications, business deals, mortgage clearances, all written to build, to protect, to uplift. This one was different. This one was meant to erase. He looked up, hoping to find a flicker of doubt in her eyes. Instead, he saw something else. Impatience. The kind of look people give when they're trying to get through an uncomfortable chore quickly. He wanted to ask her why. Why she couldn't just let him stay in the home he built with his hands. The home that held her laughter, her childhood, her mother's memories. But the words wouldn't come. Something inside him refused to beg. And then came the moment that broke him. As he hesitated, trying to find a way to delay this quiet exile, she stepped closer and said, "Papa, please don't make this harder than it already is." Then, with a gentle but firm push, she guided him toward the door. Her touch wasn't cruel, but it wasn't kind either. It was the touch of someone finishing a task. He stumbled slightly, catching himself on the wall. For a second, he saw the image reflected in the hallway mirror, her face cold, his bent with confusion. It looked almost like a stranger was evicting an old man she didn't know. She didn't look back when he paused at the doorstep. Her husband walked ahead, leading him toward the car. The rain had started, soft at first, then harder. By the time they reached the vehicle, his coat was damp. He turned once more toward the house, the one he had built for her, and whispered to himself, "So this is what love looks like when it gets tired." The drive was silent, except for the rain tapping against the windows. He tried to memorize every turn of the road, every familiar street, as though each one was a page in a story that was closing for good. When they arrived, the building looked almost cheerful. Bright flowers by the entrance, a painted sign with golden letters. It was meant to look like comfort, but he saw only confinement. The receptionist smiled too brightly, the same way people smile when they're paid to be kind. Papers were signed, hands were shaken, and his daughter's relief was visible the moment the pen lifted from the page. He was shown to a room, small, neat, and cold. One bed, one dresser, one window. It didn't feel like home. It felt like waiting. When she left, she kissed him on the forehead, a gesture that once meant love. Now it felt like punctuation, the end of a sentence. "I'll come by soon," she said, and walked away without looking back. The sound of her heels faded down the hallway until all that remained was the hum of fluorescent lights and the soft buzz of distant televisions. That night, he didn't cry. He just sat on the bed, staring at his hands. The same hands that once carried her through fevers, wrote her tuition checks, and built the very roof she slept under. Now they sat empty, resting on a bed that wasn't his. He looked out the window. The rain hadn't stopped. He could hear it tapping against the glass, steady and cold, almost like a reminder of how easily warmth can vanish. But beneath the ache, something else began to stir. It wasn't rage. Rage burns fast and leaves ashes. This was something slower, quieter, a simmering resolve. He had always lived by one rule. If life pushes you down, stand up with something it can't take away. So, as the rain fell outside, he began to think. He thought about every document he had ever signed, every deal he had made, every connection he had built over the years. He remembered that the world ran on paper, not emotion, and paper was something he understood well. He stayed quiet for the next few days, learning the rhythm of the place. He noticed how the staff moved, how the administrators talked about budgets, how decisions were made. It wasn't a home, it was a business, and businesses could be bought, owned, and controlled. Each evening, as he listened to the others complain about being forgotten, he began planning. He would not die in a place someone else chose for him. He would make sure that if this place became his reality, it would be on his own terms, not hers. Every quiet meal, every long night, every small humiliation turned into fuel. He knew what she thought, that he would fade quietly into the background of her life, becoming just another story she'd tell when guilt came knocking. But she was wrong. He wasn't a burden. He was a builder, and builders, even when stripped of everything, know how to start again. That night, as thunder rolled in the distance, he stood at the window once more. The reflection staring back wasn't weak or defeated. It was calm, focused, and alive. He whispered to himself, not as a prayer, but as a promise. If she thinks she's rid of me, she's forgotten who taught her how to win. He went to bed with that thought burning quietly inside him. The next morning, he woke before dawn, his routine still intact. An old man's discipline that never fades. He sat at the small table, drinking the thin coffee they served, and smiled faintly. There was work to do. He had nothing left to lose, and that made him dangerous in the most patient way possible. The daughter had shoved him into this home to forget him. But what she didn't know was that by placing him there, she had placed him in the one place where he could finally plan without distraction. And that was the day, that quiet, gray, rainy day, when the father the world thought was finished began writing his second chapter. The chapter where loss turned into ownership. The chapter where a shove became a signature. The chapter where a father's silence became the loudest response a daughter would ever hear. The days that followed were strangely peaceful, too peaceful for what he felt inside. The home was quiet, predictable, built on schedules and routines. Morning medication, afternoon tea, evening television. The other residents had accepted their fates long ago, moving through the halls like shadows of who they once were. But he was different. He wasn't ready to surrender yet. He sat most mornings by the same window, a small corner that looked out toward the garden. From there, he could see the caretakers watering the plants and the birds landing on the fence. The rhythm of the place was slow, but his mind was not. Inside him, thoughts moved like chess pieces, quietly, precisely, preparing for something no one could see. He had spent his entire life building things, a family, a business, a home. He knew how to plan, how to fix, how to rebuild. And though the world now saw him as just another frail old man in a chair, he knew better. Age doesn't erase the mind, it sharpens it in different ways. Each day, as he watched the nurses pass by, he thought about his daughter's face, not with hatred, but with clarity. He could now see the pattern clearly, the small acts of selfishness that had grown into something bigger, the skipped calls, the excuses, the calculated decisions made behind polite words. She didn't become cruel overnight. She simply became comfortable treating kindness as weakness. That was the moment he decided something inside himself. If love could fade so quietly, then revenge could rise in the same silence. Not through violence or anger, but through reason. The same reason he had used to build everything she now took for granted. He began each morning the same way. He'd drink his weak tea, open his notebook, and write. It wasn't poetry or diary entries, it was planning. He listed his assets, his shares, the few savings accounts still under his name. Every detail mattered. The home gave him time, and time was all he needed. He didn't tell anyone his plan. Not the other residents, not the caretakers, not even the kind nurse who often lingered by his room. He smiled when spoken to, nodded during group meals, and played the part of the quiet, harmless old man who had accepted his fate. But inside, he was rewriting his story, one legal clause at a time. He called it his quiet war. During lunch, he'd listen to the staff talk. They complained about budgets, about the new investors, about how management was stretched thin. Every complaint was a clue, every whisper a window. He learned the structure of the place from their gossip. Who owned what? Who made decisions? Who was struggling financially? He started asking harmless questions to the staff, questions that sounded like curiosity, but were really research. How long has this home been around? Do the same people own all these branches? What happens when an owner wants to sell? They thought he was just trying to pass time, an old man making conversation. They didn't know he was gathering ammunition. At night, when the others slept, he'd sit in his room with a dim lamp and go through his papers again. His mind, though aged, still worked like a machine when it came to numbers and ownership. He traced every account, every policy, every piece of land he had ever invested in. Slowly, he pieced together what would become the foundation of his plan. He realized that while his daughter had control over his daily life, she had never cared enough to understand his financial world. She didn't know about the small business shares he'd kept from his early partnerships. She didn't remember the mutual funds he'd opened in her mother's name before she passed. Those were still active, still valuable. He had kept them quiet all these years, partly out of habit, partly out of humility. Now they would become the key. One afternoon, a financial newsletter came in the mailroom, something meant for another resident. He asked if he could borrow it. As he read, he came across an article about investment trusts and private facilities being sold due to management struggles. The name of the company running his care home was mentioned in a small paragraph. They were expanding too quickly, short on funds, and selling partial stakes to raise capital. That single paragraph lit the match. He now had both motive and opportunity. The next morning, he called his lawyer, an old friend, someone who had handled his affairs for years and still respected him deeply. They spoke briefly, carefully. The lawyer came to visit a few days later under the guise of a family friend. The staff didn't question it. Together, in the quiet of his small room, they reviewed the documents. It was all possible, legal, discreet, effective. He could buy a controlling stake in the company that owned the home, using his remaining assets and a private partner. It wouldn't be easy. It would take time, but he had nothing but time now. Each step was planned with surgical precision. He liquidated a few old investments, converted assets quietly, and used the lawyer to handle negotiations. He didn't even need to leave the home. Everything was done with phone calls, signatures, and sealed envelopes. The world had made technology so efficient that even an old man could move millions without stepping outside. Every night, as he sat in bed, he thought about the irony. The daughter who had placed him here to forget him had no idea that her solution was now becoming her undoing. The home began to change subtly in the weeks that followed. The staff became more polite around him. The manager started addressing him as Mr. instead of Sir. Papers moved quietly behind closed doors. Ownership was shifting, not dramatically, but steadily. He didn't rush the process. He didn't want a scene. He wanted precision. He remembered something his late wife once told him when life had knocked them down during their early years. You don't always have to fight fire with fire. Sometimes you smother it with patience. That's exactly what he was doing now. Patience became his armor. Silence became his sword. Every slight his daughter had thrown his way became fuel. Every insult she wrapped in politeness became motivation. Every forgotten visit, every cold glance, all of it turned into quiet strength. When other residents complained about being trapped, he smiled faintly. He knew he wasn't trapped. He was merely stationed, like a soldier waiting for orders only he could give. And when he finally received word from his lawyer, the soft, calm confirmation that the majority of shares were now under his name, he didn't feel triumph. He felt peace. The kind of peace that comes when justice doesn't need applause. He looked around his small room one last time that night. The lamp, the old chair, the single photo of his wife on the desk. Everything he needed was right there. Memory, meaning, and now, control. He smiled, not because he had won, but because he had endured. He didn't need revenge that screamed. He needed one that stood. The next time his daughter came to visit, she found him reading by the window, calm and distant. She didn't know that behind that stillness lay the greatest twist of her life, that her father, the man she had tried to store away like an old book, now owned the walls around her. But he said nothing. Not yet. Revenge was sweetest when served with quiet dignity, the kind that doesn't shout, only waits. He waited with the same patience he had taught her as a child, except this time she was the one who would be learning. And so, the man who had once been shoved into the shadows began preparing to step into the light, not as a victim, but as the owner. He woke early that morning with a clear mind. The world outside was quiet, the light soft against the window pane. The silence was not heavy anymore. It was focus. He had spent days thinking, replaying his past, counting the years, the moments, and now the next move was set in his heart. He had accepted that pain was done. What remained was clarity, the kind of sharp calm that only comes after everything you love tries to break you. He sat at the small desk in his room, opened a plain notebook, and began to write. He wasn't writing thoughts or feelings anymore. This was a blueprint. The same way he once mapped the foundation of his first house, he now mapped something else, a slow, patient design to take back his life. Each line was a step. Each word was a move. He began by listing every small source of strength left to him, not emotions, not people, facts, accounts, investments, old papers that carried his name, deeds he still held quietly in the bank locker. He had built a life with steady hands and clear work. That meant there were still traces of ownership in places his daughter had forgotten existed. He underlined each one carefully. He wrote down the contact of his lawyer, the one man who had never once broken his trust. That lawyer had handled his estate and his taxes when others barely remembered his birthday. He called him that morning, his voice steady, deliberate. The younger man recognized it immediately, the tone of someone not seeking help, but giving instruction. Over the next days, the lawyer visited discreetly. They sat together, sometimes for hours, going over documents and options. He asked the right questions, simple and direct. Who owns this home? What company runs it? Can someone buy it? What shares exist? The lawyer brought files, databases, reports. Together they learned how the home worked. It wasn't owned by a single person. It was a business under a chain of companies. That meant it could be bought like any other business. That night, when the lawyer left, the old man stayed awake long after lights out. He thought about it over and over. It was possible. It would take care, timing, and quiet money. But it could be done. He started collecting what he needed. He called his old accountant, using the excuse of updating his taxes. The man was happy to help. Through this, he learned how much capital he could legally move without raising attention. It wasn't much, but it was enough to start. He also learned which of his investments could be liquidated quickly. There were bonds, savings certificates, even a few shares from an old partnership. Over the next few weeks, he began freeing the money. But the most powerful part of his plan was patience. He understood that revenge shouted, but justice waited. So he waited. Every morning, while the other residents played cards or watched TV, he sat in the library with his notes. The staff thought he was simply reading, an old man with too much time. They didn't know he was reading company reports, memorizing numbers, tracing ownership patterns. He wanted to understand the roots before cutting the tree. He learned that the care home's parent company was struggling. They were overextended, managing too many facilities and carrying too much debt. They had plans to sell parts of their holdings to raise funds. This was his chance, not for vengeance yet, but for control. He sent his lawyer instructions. They would approach the company not as victims, but as investors. The lawyer would represent him as a private shareholder, looking for stable long-term assets. It sounded harmless, even flattering to the company that someone wanted to buy in. They agreed quickly. Money speaks a language that no argument can silence. In small steps, he began acquiring shares, some through his lawyer, some through his accountant. Each transaction was legal, clean, and quiet. He made sure no one connected his name publicly to the purchases. He didn't want attention. He wanted leverage. In the evenings, he still smiled at the nurses and talked kindly to the other residents. No one knew that the quiet, polite old man by the garden was slowly becoming their employer. Weeks passed, and paperwork became progress. His lawyer updated him regularly. His ownership was now visible in private records, though not yet publicly known. It was real. It was happening. And it was all done by law. No tricks, no lies. When his lawyer told him that the controlling stake was finally within reach, he didn't smile. He simply nodded. Victory wasn't joy to him. It was peace. He remembered something his wife once said when times were hard. If they don't see your worth, show them your work. That line echoed in his heart as he prepared for the final step. He signed the last document with steady hands. His lawyer filed it with the registrar the same day. When the process was complete, a new record was added to the company's ownership log. The controlling shares now belonged to him, the man who had been left at their mercy. He didn't rush to reveal it. He gave it time to settle legally, quietly. He knew his daughter would visit soon. She always came when she wanted something signed or handled. This time, she would find something very different. He began to imagine that moment, not with glee, but with gravity. He thought of her words the day she left him there, the cold tone, the casual detachment. He wondered if she would even remember saying them. But it didn't matter now. Some lessons teach themselves. The plan wasn't built on hate, it was built on memory, the kind that doesn't fade when someone pushes you away. It was the memory of all the times he had carried her, paid her school fees, bought her a first car, comforted her in heartbreak. It was the memory of every small moment when love was given freely, only to be repaid with neglect. And now he had built something new from that pain, not revenge, but correction, a balance restored in quiet dignity. The next step was preparation for ownership. He reviewed the home's structure, staff salaries, maintenance costs, residents' needs. He wanted it to function well. He didn't want to ruin it. He wanted it to run better, kinder. He planned small reforms, better food, more freedom for residents, staff bonuses. His plan wasn't to destroy, it was to rebuild the right way, to prove that kindness could govern better than greed. He wrote a note to himself that night and pinned it beside his bed. Do not let anger write what compassion can sign. That line guided him through the final stages. When everything was finalized, he made one last call to his lawyer. Let the transition notice go out, he said softly. It was the quietest sentence he had spoken in months, but it carried the full weight of his journey. The next morning, an internal notice was delivered to the home's management. New ownership, new policies, effective immediately. The staff gathered to read it, confused but curious. None of them knew the name on the top of the document belonged to the man sitting calmly in room 12. He didn't attend the meeting. He simply sat by his window, watching sunlight spill across the garden. He didn't need to see the reaction. He already knew what it would be. Shock, whispers, realization. For the first time in months, he breathed fully. The air tasted different, lighter. He wasn't someone's burden anymore. He wasn't trapped. He was the owner. The plan had been simple, lawful, and absolute. He had used the very system that discarded him to correct itself. He hadn't shouted, hadn't begged, hadn't cursed. He had planned, waited, and acted the way real power moves, quietly. That night, he slept early. Outside, the lights of the building glowed soft and steady, his building now. When he woke, he didn't feel like a victor. He felt like a man who had finally walked back into the home of his own soul. The plan was complete. The transaction happened so quietly that no one in the home or the family suspected anything. It was not a storm. It was a sunrise. Soft, slow, steady, but certain. The purchase began with signatures, just ink, paper, and silence. His lawyer had already drafted the necessary agreements, the transfer of majority ownership, the clauses for management oversight, and the registry filings. Every line was read 3 times. Every comma was deliberate. This wasn't vengeance written in anger. It was justice recorded in law. The father sat in the lawyer's office that morning, a faint smell of paper and ink filling the air. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from age. Yet when the pen touched the paper, his grip was firm. Each signature carried not just legal weight, but emotional history. Years of loyalty, abandonment, and rediscovered power. When the final page was done, he didn't celebrate. He simply exhaled. The lawyer smiled, shook his hand, and said, "It's official." But those words didn't feel triumphant. They felt peaceful, like a door had quietly closed on years of humiliation. From that moment forward, he owned the very place where he had been left to fade. The same halls that once echoed with loneliness were now under his authority. The same rooms where staff looked at him as just another resident now belonged to his ledger. He didn't rush to announce anything. He spent the next few days watching how things ran, observing the staff, the operations, the management. He noticed everything, the care, the shortcuts, the indifference. He saw how his daughter's visits had become less about love and more about checking boxes. She came with polite smiles, asked the manager if everything was fine, and then left quickly, thinking her duty was done. She had no idea that each time she walked through those doors, she was stepping into her father's property. The father made quiet adjustments. He replaced some of the old equipment. He increased staff pay slightly. He ordered better food. The residents noticed, smiling more, but no one knew why things had changed. Only the manager knew the truth, and he had been instructed to keep it that way. Then came the financial restructuring, the part that would change everything. His daughter, unaware of the new ownership, was still listed as one of the financial sponsors for her father's room. She had set up automatic payments years ago, small amounts deducted monthly from a joint account they once shared. But now, under the new terms, the home required direct billing. Every resident's family had to sign updated agreements with the new management, his management. He reviewed every policy change with meticulous care. The contracts were fair, legal, and written with compassion, but they had one simple condition: late payments incurred penalties, and family guarantors could not withdraw without notice. The daughter, of course, didn't read the new paperwork carefully. She simply signed it during her next visit, assuming nothing had changed. He watched her do it from his chair by the window, eyes steady, heart quiet. She signed the paper that placed her under his terms, not hers. She smiled faintly at him as she left, never realizing what she had just done. Over the next few weeks, he continued to run the home through his lawyer and new administrator. Staff morale improved. The residents felt respected again. It was no longer a place of confinement. It became a community. Every detail reflected his quiet dignity. But he knew the moment of truth would come soon. The new billing cycle began. Payment notices were sent to every sponsor, including his daughter. When she opened the envelope at home, she frowned. The letterhead was different, new, more formal. The rates had changed slightly to reflect better service. It wasn't much, just enough to make her curious. She picked up the phone and called the care home. The administrator answered politely and explained the policy changes. "We're under new ownership now, ma'am," she said. "Everything has been restructured." His daughter grew annoyed. "Who approved that?" she asked sharply. The administrator smiled and said, "Our new majority shareholder, ma'am." "Mr." She paused and said the father's full name. There was silence on the other end. The daughter hung up. That evening, she drove to the home in a rush. She didn't even check in with reception. She stormed down the hall and opened his door without knocking. There he sat, calm, composed, a faint smile on his face, reading a book near the window. For a long moment, she didn't speak. The realization was too heavy. Everything she had done, the decision to send him here, the excuses she had made to others, the coldness she had justified as practical, had turned into her own undoing. The man she had treated as a burden now owned the place she used to manage with pride. He looked up, closed his book, and met her eyes. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The silence between them said everything. She tried to speak, but her voice cracked. "Why would you?" she began, but stopped, because deep down, she knew why. The next day, she met with the home's administrator, trying to understand the details. Every explanation led back to the same truth. Everything had been done legally. Every step was in order. Every signature valid. There was no loophole, no way to reverse it. She tried calling the lawyer, but he refused to discuss it. Confidentiality, he said. The law was not on her side. That week, her payment notice came again, this time with her name clearly printed under tenant sponsor. The irony was impossible to miss. The daughter who had once placed her father in a care home was now paying rent to live in his world. Word began to spread among relatives. Some were shocked, others quietly applauded. Those who knew her arrogance over the years called it poetic justice. The father didn't care for gossip. He kept his dignity. He didn't mock, didn't brag, didn't gloat. When staff tried to congratulate him privately, he waved them off gently. "This isn't a victory," he said softly. "It's balance." He spent the next month ensuring the place was run with empathy. He made sure no one there would ever feel discarded again. He expanded meal options, added books, and built a small garden for the residents. Every improvement came not from revenge, but from experience. He had lived the pain, and he refused to let anyone else feel it. His daughter began visiting again, but not out of duty, out of guilt. She sat in silence during those visits, unsure how to bridge the space between them. He didn't make it easier, nor harder. He simply let time do what time does best, teach. And time did teach. One afternoon, the home's financial department called her about a delayed payment. Her card had bounced due to an error. The irony was sharper this time. The man she had once accused of being old and confused now held her name on a ledger. She paid quietly that day. The father never spoke to her about it. He didn't need to. The law, the paperwork, and her conscience did all the speaking for him. The purchase was not just financial, it was symbolic. It meant reclaiming respect, autonomy, and the power to define his own worth. It meant proving that being old didn't mean being weak. It meant that compassion could be stronger than cruelty when guided by patience and knowledge. He often sat by his window, looking at the staff moving through their day, hearing laughter in the halls. It wasn't revenge he felt. It was restoration. He had taken what was broken and made it whole again. When his daughter passed him in the hallway now, she didn't walk with pride anymore. She walked with respect. She greeted him softly. Sometimes she brought flowers. Sometimes she said nothing. But the silence between them had changed. It was no longer filled with bitterness. It was filled with understanding. That was all he had ever wanted. The purchase had given him more than ownership. It had given him closure. He didn't need to prove himself anymore. The world that once treated him as forgotten now ran by his signature. He had used patience where others would use rage. He had used reason where others would seek revenge. And as the sun set outside his window each evening, he smiled faintly, knowing that everything had come full circle. The same rain that once soaked him in loneliness now watered the garden he had built inside the home he owned. His story wasn't about payback. It was about power earned through dignity. The man who had once been shoved aside was now the foundation of everything that stood around him. The day of revelation came quietly, without warning, without spectacle. It was the kind of day that began with light rain and slow clouds, the kind of day no one expects history to remember. Yet for him, it was the day the world balanced its scales. He woke early as usual, long before breakfast, and sat by the window with his tea. The garden below glistened faintly from last night's drizzle. He could hear the faint murmur of staff changing shifts, the wheels of breakfast carts rolling across the hall, and the usual morning chatter between residents. But inside him, there was a stillness deeper than silence. He knew what was about to unfold, not because he planned it for drama, but because every law and every line of paper he'd signed had led here. That morning, his daughter arrived unannounced, her face drawn with confusion and faint irritation. She had received another notice, this one with new terms, a revised bill, and an updated signature line. This time, the letter bore a new name at the top. Managing Director, Mr. his full name. She thought it was a mistake, a clerical error perhaps, or maybe a cruel coincidence, but a small knot of dread had already begun twisting inside her chest as she parked the car. She walked briskly through the entrance, heels tapping sharp against the marble. The receptionist greeted her politely and asked her to wait. She didn't. She went straight to the administrative office, pushing the door open mid-sentence as the manager was briefing two staff members. "Is this some kind of joke?" she demanded, waving the paper. The manager, a calm woman in her 40s who had been briefed about everything, met her gaze without flinching. "No, ma'am," she said gently. "All ownership and management rights were legally transferred last month. The new majority shareholder is your father." Her lips parted, but no words came out. For a moment, the world around her seemed to stop. The faint hum of the air conditioner, the shuffle of papers, the distant sound of dishes clinking from the dining hall. "My father?" she whispered, as if the words themselves felt foreign. The manager nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Mr. his name. He's been overseeing improvements and policy updates personally. We're very proud to have him as our new director." She blinked, speechless. Her father, the man she had placed here to be cared for, the man she had convinced herself was too weak, too old, too irrelevant to live independently, now owned the entire establishment. The truth hit her like a wave. While she had been busy living her comfortable life, her father had been quietly rebuilding his. Her legs felt weak as she left the office. She didn't even notice that the staff greeted her differently now, politely, but without the old deference she had once demanded. They knew the story. They had seen the documents. They had watched the transformation in silence. She walked down the hall, her heart pounding. Every step echoed louder than the last. When she reached her father's room, she paused. The door was half open. Inside, he sat at his small wooden table, reading the newspaper, glasses low on his nose, calm as ever. She knocked gently. He looked up, and their eyes met, hers wide with disbelief, his steady with quiet knowing. She stepped inside, holding the letter in one trembling hand. Her throat tightened. You own this place now?" she finally managed to say. He folded the paper neatly and placed it aside. His face showed no anger, no pride, just a calm that came from peace earned, not taken. He didn't need to say yes. The answer was written everywhere, in the room's upgraded furniture, in the faint scent of fresh paint from the renovated hallways, in the staff's respectful tone whenever they passed by. She looked around, suddenly seeing everything differently. What once felt like a place of guilt and obligation now stood as a monument to her own blindness. He gestured softly toward the chair across from him. She sat down, still gripping the paper. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence between them. Not the silence of hostility, but of heavy realization. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, unshaken. "You brought me here because you said it was what I needed," he said. "Maybe it was. But I made sure it became what I deserved." The words were not cruel. They were simple truth. Tears pricked her eyes, but she blinked them away. Pride, the same pride she had inherited from him, would not let them fall. He continued, his tone soft but deliberate. "I didn't buy this place to punish you. I bought it to remind you that life doesn't end when someone decides it should. You thought you put me away. You only gave me time to think." She lowered her gaze. Each word was a mirror, reflecting her own choices back at her. He reached for a folder on the table and slid it toward her. Inside were documents, the official ownership certificates, board meeting records, and financial reports. All with his name, all legitimate. "These are copies," he said. "The originals are filed with the company registrar. Everything is in order." Her hands trembled as she flipped through the pages. Every seal, every signature, every line of text confirmed what she couldn't deny. She looked up, eyes glassy. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered. He smiled faintly, a smile that carried decades of patience. "Because you wouldn't have listened." The truth stung more than any accusation. For the first time, she saw the depth of the man sitting across from her, not as a fragile old figure in a home, but as the same man who had once built a business from nothing, raised a family on honor, and faced life's storms without flinching. The daughter who had thought herself powerful suddenly felt small, childish. When she finally spoke again, her voice was softer, stripped of the sharpness that once defined it. "What happens now?" He leaned back, eyes calm. "Now," he said quietly. "Now you learn what it feels like to wait for someone else's decisions." She closed the folder slowly, unable to look at him. He didn't gloat. He didn't scold. He simply turned back to his window, gazing at the garden outside, where sunlight broke through the clouds and fell on the flowers swaying gently in the breeze. For him, that moment wasn't about victory, it was about release. The weight that had sat on his chest for months, the ache of betrayal, the humiliation of being discarded, all of it drifted away like mist in morning light. He had proven his point, not with anger, but with quiet mastery. In the days that followed, the news spread quietly through the staff, the community, and even among distant relatives. Whispers turned into admiration. "The old man who bought the home," they called him. To the staff, he became a symbol of dignity, proof that patience and intelligence could win where rage and shouting failed. His daughter began to visit more often after that day, but not with authority, with humility. Sometimes she came bearing flowers, sometimes books, sometimes just silent company. She started talking to him again, slowly, cautiously, like someone learning to speak a forgotten language. He never shut her out. He let her come, let her see, let her feel. He didn't need apologies. He needed understanding, and as the weeks passed, that understanding began to grow. She started helping around the home, volunteering time, organizing events for residents. The same place she once treated as a burden became a space of redemption. Every time she signed a check, saw a policy, or spoke with the manager, she was reminded of the truth, that the man she had once called too old to manage now ran an entire home, quietly and gracefully. For the father, that was the real revelation. Not her shock, not her shame, but her awakening. Watching his daughter rediscover respect was worth more than any money or power. In the end, he didn't seek revenge. He sought renewal, and he got it. The home flourished under his guidance. The residents smiled more. The staff stayed longer. The place became known not as a care home, but as a sanctuary. And the daughter, slowly but surely, began to understand what she had nearly destroyed. Sometimes, as they sat together in the garden, she would look at him and whisper, "I'm proud of you, Dad." He would simply nod, saying nothing, letting the moment breathe. Because in truth, the revelation wasn't just hers. It was his too. He had proven something profound, that no act of cruelty, no shove, no betrayal can destroy a person who still believes in their own worth. He had turned exile into empire, silence into authority, and pain into purpose. The world hadn't changed overnight, but he had, and that was enough. That was his revelation. The days that followed the revelation changed everything. The home, once filled with quiet routine and invisible power lines, now pulsed with whispers. The staff talked in hushed tones, eyes full of surprise and respect whenever they passed him in the hallway. They'd seen residents come and go for years, but never had they seen something like this. An old man who had arrived broken, now walking as the rightful owner of the roof over their heads. His daughter's name, once carried with pride among relatives, began to travel with embarrassment. The story spread faster than gossip usually does in small towns. People talked, not cruelly, but with disbelief. They said things like, "Did you hear? The man his daughter abandoned now owns the very home she put him in." Some spoke it with admiration, some with shame, and others with awe. She began to feel the weight of it wherever she went, at the grocery store, in church, even among friends. No one confronted her outright, but their looks said enough. Pity mixed with judgment. It wasn't the kind of scandal that shouted, it was the kind that lingered. But the father didn't bask in that attention. He ignored it. To him, the noise outside meant nothing. He was done proving himself to anyone. The only thing he cared about now was keeping the place running better than ever, and ensuring no one else would be discarded the way he had been. He began showing up to weekly staff meetings, not to command, but to listen. He encouraged the younger caregivers, reminded them that their kindness mattered more than efficiency. He created a small fund to support residents who couldn't afford certain treatments or family visits. Within weeks, the atmosphere changed. Laughter returned to the halls. People smiled when they saw him. The place began to feel alive again. Meanwhile, his daughter wrestled with her conscience. The shock had faded, but the guilt had only grown. She still came to visit, but her visits were quiet now. No more pretending to check on him. No more patronizing smiles. Just silence, small talk, and sometimes tears she tried to hide. One evening, she arrived with her husband. The two of them sat opposite him in the lounge, both uneasy, both unsure where to begin. The husband finally broke the silence, apologizing in his own clumsy way. The father listened, not with bitterness, but with the calm of someone who has already moved on. He didn't need apologies anymore. The world had already delivered the lesson he couldn't have spoken better himself. Still, he looked at his daughter and said quietly, "Do you understand now?" She nodded, unable to speak. That night, she went home and cried for hours. Not because of the embarrassment, but because she finally realized how small she had made her father feel. How blind she had been to the quiet strength of the man who had given her everything. In the weeks that followed, she began visiting not as a daughter fulfilling duty, but as a woman trying to rebuild something broken. She brought food, not because she had to, but because she wanted to share. She began helping residents, reading to them, speaking kindly to the staff. Her father watched this transformation with cautious pride. She was learning, not through lectures, but through consequence. The home's residents often whispered that there was something poetic about it all. The daughter who had once pushed her father into this place now working to make it better. They saw her carrying trays, watering plants, laughing softly with the nurses. Slowly, she became part of the home's healing, just as her father had become its foundation. Still, there were days when guilt weighed heavy. She would find herself standing outside his office door, hesitating before knocking, because she still didn't know how to face him fully. Sometimes she left without entering. Sometimes she did. And every time, he greeted her the same way. Calm, steady, never cruel. Their relationship began to rebuild, not through apologies, but through time shared in silence. They started having tea together in the evenings. Sometimes they talked about the home's progress. Sometimes they just watched the rain. She'd tell him small stories about her children, about life outside. He'd listen, occasionally smiling, occasionally offering a single line of advice that carried the weight of a lifetime. The rest of the family, relatives, cousins, old friends, heard the full story eventually. Some called it revenge, others called it redemption. But those who knew him best understood that it was never about revenge. It was about restoring balance. He had taken something cruel and turned it into something righteous, something that helped others. The daughter's husband tried to repair things too. He offered financial help, tried to buy back the shares on her behalf. The father refused, not out of spite, but principle. "You can't buy back respect," he said. And he was right. Months passed. The home prospered. The father's leadership brought new funding, better care, and a waiting list of people hoping to join. Newspapers caught wind of the story, a small feature about a retired man who transformed a care home from within. The article never mentioned his family, but everyone who read it understood what it meant. The daughter framed that article later, hanging it in her living room, not out of pride, but as a reminder. By then, she had changed. She started visiting her father not out of guilt, but out of love. She began bringing her own children, letting them hear his stories, teaching them the respect she once forgot. They called him Grandpa with the big house, not realizing that the house wasn't built from money, but from patience and pain turned into strength. The fallout wasn't just punishment, it was transformation. For her, it was humility. For him, it was peace. He saw her remorse not as defeat, but as rebirth. He understood now that sometimes people need to lose everything they take for granted before they can see clearly again. As for the home, it became his legacy, a place that would outlive him, a testament to quiet justice and the kind of love that doesn't vanish even after being betrayed. Every night before bed, he would walk the halls. He'd nod to the staff, check on the residents, smile at the familiar faces. Then he'd stop by the window in the main corridor, looking out at the city lights flickering in the distance. He would think of the storm that once drenched him, the night his daughter pushed him away, and the warmth of the life he now lived. He didn't thank fate. He thanked himself for never surrendering to anger, for turning humiliation into grace, for teaching his daughter the lesson words never could. The fallout had reshaped every life it touched. It had burned away the false comfort, the arrogance, the noise, and what remained was truth. He was no longer just a resident in a home. He was the architect of its heart. And in the quiet corners of his mind, he whispered the same thought every time he saw his daughter smile again. She shoved me into this place, but in the end, I helped her find her soul here. That was the real victory, not the ownership, not the title, not the power. The victory was that both of them, in their own way, had been changed forever by one act of cruelty that turned into a lifetime of understanding. And so, in the aftermath of betrayal came something greater: peace, dignity, and a love reborn through silence. Peace came slowly, not like a sudden dawn, but like the steady light that grows after years of darkness. It didn't roar, didn't shout, didn't announce itself. It just settled quietly into the corners of his life, filling the spaces where hurt had once lived. For the first time in years, he slept through the night without waking to the sound of regret. The ceiling above him no longer felt like confinement. It felt like home. He had turned a place built for waiting into a place built for living. The walls, once reminders of abandonment, now echoed with laughter from residents, care from the staff, and his own calm footsteps walking the halls he now owned. He no longer felt small in his own world. His mornings began with routine, a soft sunrise through his window, the smell of coffee brewing in the shared kitchen, the faint hum of nurses chatting at their stations. He'd put on his slippers, pick up the newspaper, and walk out into the garden he'd personally funded, a garden filled with fresh roses, mint, tulips, and lemon trees. He'd sit on the bench under the oak tree and watch the staff bring residents out for their morning walks. Some waved at him, others stopped to talk. Every "good morning" was a quiet acknowledgement of respect, not pity. He spent hours reading under that tree, philosophy, history, even cookbooks. Books didn't just teach him anymore, they kept him company. The silence that once felt cruel now felt sacred. It was in that stillness that he finally met himself, not as a father, not as a victim, not as a man betrayed, but as a survivor who had outlived every storm. Sometimes residents would join him. He'd tell them stories, not of revenge, but of balance. He told them how patience, when paired with knowledge, can move mountains. They listened with admiration, often forgetting he wasn't just one of them. He was the man who made their lives better. He didn't flaunt ownership. He lived it quietly, with grace. Afternoons were peaceful. He'd walk through the halls, stopping to chat with the cooks, taste their soups, offer advice about flavor or presentation, old habits from his younger days. He remembered teaching his daughter to cook when she was small, showing her how to measure spices with her fingertips. Those memories no longer brought pain. They brought warmth, a gentle reminder that love, even when broken, once existed sincerely. Evenings became his favorite time. The home glowed with golden light, the kind that softened the edges of the world. He'd sit in the common area where residents gathered for tea. Sometimes they'd sing, sometimes just watch television. Sometimes his daughter would join, quietly sitting beside him, pouring him tea like she used to when she was young. Their words were few, but their silence was kind. The transformation between them wasn't instant. It was slow, real, human. She began to stay longer, not out of duty, but comfort. Sometimes she'd bring files for him to review, helping him manage the home's paperwork. He'd smile at how she had grown into discipline through humility. Other times, she'd bring her children. The grandchildren would run through the hallways, laughing, waving at nurses, calling, "Grandpa," with bright, unguarded joy. The staff adored them, and he did too. It was during one of those evenings, while watching his grandkids chase each other in the garden, that he realized something profound. The pain he had carried had become a bridge. What was once a wound had turned into wisdom. Through his silence, his daughter had learned. Through her mistakes, he had healed. The community beyond the home began to notice him differently too. Local newspapers wrote small features about the old man who turned pain into purpose. Journalists came to interview him, but he refused grand statements. "I'm not a hero," he'd say. "I just learned that waiting quietly is sometimes the loudest answer." He became something of a legend, not for revenge, but for restoration. People came to visit him, asking for advice about family disputes, business fairness, dignity in old age. He always gave the same answer: don't raise your voice, raise your value. Every Sunday, he'd visit the small chapel built near the back of the property, another of his renovations. He'd sit there for an hour, not to pray for forgiveness, but to give thanks for balance. The man who had once been thrown aside now governed with grace. He ensured that every resident had what he once lacked: dignity. He doubled the home's care budget, improved the food, allowed visiting hours without restriction, and gave staff better pay. Kindness was no longer policy. It was culture. Under his quiet leadership, the place changed from a care home to a haven. His daughter watched this transformation with awe. She had once thought success came from wealth and convenience. Now she saw that real success came from peace, from waking up without shame, from being trusted, from being kind. She became involved too, not as a manager or investor, but as a volunteer. She spent weekends helping organize birthdays for the residents, decorating halls, and planning small music events. Her father watched, not with smugness, but with a deep, unspoken relief. He knew then that life had given him something greater than revenge, redemption for both of them. As time passed, his health began to decline slowly, naturally. But he didn't fear it anymore. He had done what he came to do. He had proven that life, no matter how cruelly twisted by others, can still be rewritten with patience and precision. Some nights, he'd sit by the window with a cup of chamomile tea, watching the rain. The same rain that had once soaked him in despair now sounded gentle, forgiving. He'd smile faintly, whispering to himself, "This is what peace feels like." He had no regrets anymore. He had turned pain into progress, betrayal into balance, and humiliation into harmony. The staff adored him, not as a boss, but as a mentor. The residents loved him, not as an owner, but as one of their own. And his daughter, she loved him again, not from guilt, but from respect. Sometimes, late in the evening, she would come to his room after her shift, bringing a small notebook where she had written daily reflections. She'd read them aloud, and he'd listen with patience. Some entries were apologies, some were lessons. One evening she wrote, "You taught me what love without pride looks like. You didn't shout, you just waited, and I finally heard you." He smiled at that line, thinking how the same patience that had built his company, raised his family, and rebuilt his life had finally repaired his heart, too. The world outside might still have remembered him as the man who bought the home his daughter abandoned him to, but inside, he was something else entirely. He was a quiet architect of justice. He didn't seek to die with power. He sought to live with peace. And he had found it, in the very place meant to be his end. Now, each dawn was a small celebration, not for wealth, not for revenge, but for balance restored. He had learned that revenge loses its sharpness when forgiveness takes its place, and forgiveness doesn't always need words. Sometimes it's written in action, in calm, in ownership of self. His story wasn't about rage, it was about patience, about proving that silence, when rooted in wisdom, can reshape destiny. So, every morning, he walked through his home, past the rooms filled with soft laughter, past the smell of breakfast, past the small paintings of residents hanging proudly on the walls. He'd stop for a moment, take a deep breath, and think, "This is mine, not the walls, not the rooms, but the peace inside them." That was his reward. Not victory, not wealth, just peace, the kind that comes only when you choose dignity over despair. Now, as an old man, he sits by the same window each morning, sunlight pouring over his table, and reflects on the strange shape life took, the path from rejection to redemption, from silence to peace. His reflection is not full of bitterness. It is not even heavy with nostalgia. It is quiet, like the pages of a well-read book that no longer surprises, but still comforts every time it's opened. He has lived through everything a man could, hunger, exhaustion, loss, and betrayal, yet nothing wounded him more than being unwanted by his own blood. But that wound became his greatest teacher. It showed him that love without respect is slavery, that giving without gratitude is a slow death, and that silence, when guided by wisdom, can rebuild everything noise destroys. He remembers the night his daughter pushed him toward the home, how the rain soaked his coat as he stood outside, how the lights of her house faded behind him. For a long time, that image haunted him. Not the rain, not the cold, but the feeling of being erased. Yet now, years later, he understands something he couldn't back then. Sometimes, life removes you from comfort not to punish you, but to reintroduce you to your own strength. When he thinks about revenge, he no longer sees it as cruelty. He sees it as correction, a quiet restoration of balance. He never raised his hand, never shouted, never cursed her name. He simply chose the only weapon life had left him: patience. He turned that patience into power, that power into purpose, and that purpose into peace. He often writes in his small leather notebook lines that sound like lessons but are really memories turned into truth. He writes things like, "Dignity is the last currency the world can't steal. The law listens longer than anger ever can. A parent's silence is not weakness, it's a warning." Each sentence carries the weight of decades, the voice of a man who learned that control doesn't come from loudness, but from understanding timing. He looks around his room, the same room where he once sat heartbroken, now filled with calm and purpose. On his shelves are framed photographs, residents smiling during events, staff celebrating birthdays, even his daughter holding her own children. There is no bitterness in those frames, only the quiet truth that even broken things can be arranged beautifully when handled with care. Sometimes he smiles at the irony. The daughter who once placed him in this home now visits it every week, not to check on him, but to learn from him. She seeks his advice on management, on people, on life. The same home that was meant to hold his ending has become their shared new beginning. He doesn't remind her of her cruelty anymore. He doesn't need to. Life already did. He simply treats her with the same calm she once denied him. Because true power doesn't come from remembering the pain. It comes from knowing you survived it. He's watched her grow softer with every visit. Watched her hands tremble slightly when she pours him tea. Watched her eyes linger longer when she leaves, as if she's afraid this peace could vanish if she looks away. He never tells her, but he notices everything. He knows guilt has transformed into respect, and that is enough for him. The residents often ask him for advice. Some have children who no longer visit. Some cry quietly in their rooms, holding on to hope that someone will remember them. He sits with them and tells them what he has learned, that not all stories end with revenge, but all wounds can end with clarity. That forgiveness is not letting someone win, it's refusing to let them own your peace. He tells them how he once mistook silence for weakness, how he once begged for understanding, and how he later discovered that the loudest way to prove someone wrong is to live better than they ever expected you to. His words bring comfort to others, but they also continue healing him, one story at a time. Sometimes he looks at his hands, the same hands that once built, that once carried, that once trembled in anger. Now they are steady. The veins rise under thin skin like rivers that have seen storms but never stopped flowing. He remembers when those hands signed the papers that changed everything, not out of vengeance, but to reclaim the meaning of his own life. He has come to believe that time doesn't heal everything. It only shows what was worth keeping. In his case, it showed him that peace was never about erasing pain. It was about planting something new in its place. He no longer dreams of his past. He dreams of gardens, of the home expanding, of more rooms for those abandoned like he once was, of staff who smile because they love what they do. The same building that once symbolized shame now carries laughter through its halls. That, to him, is divine justice. Every so often he sees his daughter walking the corridors, helping the elderly, arranging flowers in vases. He stands by the doorway, watching her quietly. She never notices, but he doesn't mind. Watching her from afar is enough. Seeing that she has become gentle again is his greatest victory. There are moments when she sits beside him and says softly, "I don't know how you forgave me." He simply smiles. Forgiveness, he's learned, isn't given with words. It's shown through living. He thinks often about what he'll leave behind when his time comes. Not money, not property, but an example. That old age isn't defeat, and kindness doesn't mean surrender. He hopes that when his grandchildren grow older, they'll remember their grandfather not as the man who was thrown away, but as the man who taught their mother what love really means. His reflection, though calm, carries fire beneath it, not bitterness, but conviction. He wants the world to know that respect is not inherited, it is earned, that no matter how far someone pushes you, dignity is yours to protect. He remembers sitting outside that first night, feeling the cold on his skin, the rain dripping down his collar. He remembers whispering to himself that he would not let this be his ending. And now, years later, as he sits in a chair of his own choosing, in a home of his own ownership, he smiles, because it truly wasn't. If there is a moral to his story, it is this: Age is not weakness, and silence is not surrender. When the world strips you of everything, family, home, pride, you still have your will. And with will comes the power to rebuild. He has stopped counting his years. He measures time now in peace, in quiet mornings, in calm evenings, in the sound of rain that no longer feels cruel. Every breath feels earned. Every second feels free. Sometimes he writes letters he never sends, to his daughter, to his younger self, even to the world. In one of them, he wrote, "I used to think justice needed witnesses, but the truth is, real justice happens in silence. It doesn't humiliate, it balances, it doesn't shout, it settles." And below that, he wrote one final line that summed up everything he had lived for. "She shoved me into a place to forget me. I bought it so the world would never forget what silence can do." Then he closed the notebook, placed it on his nightstand, and smiled at the thought of how far he'd come, from being thrown out to becoming the one who holds the door open for others. Because peace, he realized, isn't given by the world. It's built, patiently, quietly, one signature, one decision, one sunrise at a time. And that is how his story ends, not with anger, not with revenge, but with peace that no storm could ever wash away.